Sarah Martinez had never imagined that organizing supply shipments would prepare her for the most terrifying and heroic moment of her life. At 28 years old, she worked as a supply coordinator for Blackwater Ridge Military Base, a remote outpost nestled in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan. Her days were filled with spreadsheets, inventory counts, and ensuring that soldiers received everything from ammunition to medical supplies on time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound as Sarah walked toward the supply depot, her boots crunching on the gravel path. She clutched a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a thick folder of requisition forms in the other. The familiar routine brought comfort in a place where comfort was rare. Morning, Martinez called out Sergeant First Class Tony Rodriguez from across the yard. He was loading crates into a transport truck, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the early hour. "Morning, Tony," Sarah replied with a tired smile. "Got your medical supplies ready. Extra morphine packs like you requested." Tony nodded gratefully. His team would be heading out to Forward Operating Base Delta in 2 hours, a dangerous outpost that had been hit by insurgent attacks 3 times in the past month. Every supply run was a calculated risk, but the men stationed there desperately needed fresh supplies. Sarah had grown up in El Paso, Texas, where her father worked as a warehouse manager for a large distribution company. From childhood, she had watched him transform chaos into order, turning piles of unsorted inventory into perfectly organized systems. When she joined the Army at 19, her natural talent for logistics quickly became apparent. "You've got a gift for this," her commanding officer had told her during basic training. "Most people see boxes and numbers. You see the bigger picture." That bigger picture was what kept Sarah motivated during long days at Blackwater Ridge. Every box she processed, every shipment she coordinated directly impacted the safety and effectiveness of soldiers in the field. When a sniper team requested specific ammunition, Sarah made sure they received exactly what they needed. When medics ran low on surgical supplies, she prioritized their orders above everything else. The supply depot was a massive warehouse filled with towering shelves that reached nearly to the ceiling. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows between the rows of carefully labeled containers. Sarah loved the organized chaos of it all. Each section had its purpose. Medical supplies in the northeast corner, ammunition along the eastern wall, food rations stacked 20 feet high in the center. "Martinez, we've got a problem with the Delta shipment," called out Corporal Mike Stevens as he jogged toward her desk. His uniform was already dirty from loading trucks, and worry creased his young face. "What kind of problem?" Sarah asked, setting down her coffee and opening her laptop. Radio equipment got mixed up with the Charlie Company shipment. They're requesting immediate replacement, but our backup radios are all being serviced. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard as she accessed the inventory database. This was exactly the kind of challenge she lived for. In 30 seconds, she had located 3 functional radio units that were designated for a training exercise scheduled for next week. Training can wait, she decided. Reassign units 7, 12, and 15 to the Delta shipment. "I'll handle the paperwork with Captain Morrison later." Mike grinned. "You're a lifesaver, Martinez." Those guys would be sitting ducks without proper communication. As Mike hurried away to retrieve the radio equipment, Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction that came with solving problems. In civilian life, logistics might seem boring to outsiders. Here, in a combat zone, proper logistics could mean the difference between life and death. The base came alive as morning progressed. Helicopters thundered overhead, carrying reconnaissance teams to remote mountain villages. Armored vehicles rumbled past the depot, kicking up clouds of dust that settled on everything. Sarah had learned to keep her workspace covered with plastic sheeting to protect the paperwork. Around noon, Captain Morrison stopped by the depot for his weekly inspection. He was a tall, serious man in his 40s who had served 3 tours in Iraq before being assigned to Afghanistan. Despite his stern demeanor, Sarah knew he respected her work. "How are we looking on ammunition for next week's patrol schedule?" he asked, scanning the neat rows of supply crates. "Fully stocked," Sarah replied confidently. "I've allocated extra rounds for the mountain patrols, considering the increased enemy activity in Sector 7. Captain Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. Intelligence suggests we might see more contact in that area." He paused, studying a clipboard full of inventory reports. "I'm recommending you for promotion, Martinez. You've consistently exceeded expectations, and, frankly, this place would fall apart without you." Heat rushed to Sarah's cheeks. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the confidence. Keep doing what you're doing," the captain said before walking away. That afternoon, Sarah received word that the supply convoy to Forward Operating Base Delta had encountered mechanical problems. Their primary transport truck had broken down 15 miles from the base, leaving them stranded with a full load of critical supplies. "We need to get those supplies to Delta before nightfall," Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes explained during an emergency briefing in the command center. "Intelligence indicates increased insurgent movement in that sector after dark." Sarah studied the terrain map spread across the conference table. The broken-down convoy was positioned in a valley surrounded by rocky hills that provided perfect cover for enemy snipers. A rescue mission would be dangerous, but abandoning the supplies wasn't an option. "What about air transport?" asked Major William Brooks, the base's operations officer. "All helicopters are committed to active missions," Colonel Hayes replied. "We need a ground solution." Sarah cleared her throat. "Ma'am, I could take a smaller truck with essential supplies. Medical equipment, ammunition, radio gear. Leave the heavier items for later recovery." The room fell silent. Colonel Hayes studied Sarah with calculating eyes. "Martinez, you're not trained for convoy operations." "No, ma'am, but I know exactly what those soldiers need most urgently. I can prioritize the load and get the critical items there quickly." Major Brooks shook his head. "Too dangerous. We should wait for morning and send a full escort." "Those men need medical supplies tonight," Sarah insisted. "Two soldiers at Delta are dealing with infected wounds. Without proper antibiotics, they could develop serious complications." Colonel Hayes considered the options for several long moments. The tactical situation was deteriorating, but Sarah's argument made sense. A small, fast-moving vehicle might be able to reach the stranded convoy and continue to Delta before enemy forces could organize an effective response. "You'll take Sergeant Rodriguez and Corporal Chun as escorts," the colonel finally decided. "Light armored vehicle, essential supplies only, and you turn back at the first sign of trouble." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, adrenaline already coursing through her veins. Within an hour, Sarah had assembled a carefully selected load of critical supplies. Medical equipment filled 1/3 of the vehicle, with ammunition, radio components, and emergency food taking up the remaining space. Every item had been chosen based on urgent need and practical value. Sergeant Rodriguez checked his M4 rifle for the third time as they prepared to depart. "You sure about this, Martinez? That's some rough country out there." "I'm sure," Sarah replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she secured the supply manifest in her cargo pocket. Corporal Chun, a quiet soldier from San Francisco, conducted a final inspection of their armored Humvee. "Vehicle's ready. We've got enough fuel to reach Delta and return with some to spare." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains as their convoy of one vehicle departed Blackwater Ridge. Sarah sat in the passenger's seat, watching the familiar landscape of the base disappear behind them. In front lay 25 miles of dangerous territory and a mission that could save lives. "Radio check," Rodriguez said into his headset as they cleared the base perimeter. "Blackwater Ridge reads you 5x5, came the reply from base communications. The road to Forward Operating Base Delta wound through a series of valleys carved by ancient rivers. Rocky hills rose on both sides, their surfaces scarred by centuries of erosion and scattered with boulders that could hide entire squads of enemy fighters. Sarah had driven this route dozens of times in the relative safety of large convoys, but Traveling with only 2 escorts felt completely different. Movement on the ridge line, Chen reported, slowing the vehicle and scanning the hills with binoculars. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed his gaze. For several tense seconds, they waited and watched. Then, Chen relaxed slightly. "Goats," he said with relief. "Whole herd of them." They continued deeper into the valley system, the engine noise echoing off the rocky walls around them. Sarah reviewed her mental inventory of the supplies they carried, calculating how quickly she could distribute the most critical items once they reached the stranded convoy. There, Rodriguez pointed ahead to where black smoke rose from behind a cluster of large boulders. "That's our guys." As they approached, Sarah could see the disabled transport truck sitting at an angle beside the road. Its rear axle had broken, leaving the heavily loaded vehicle immobilized. 3 soldiers were using the truck as cover while maintaining security. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams jogged toward their vehicle as they pulled up. His face showed the strain of spending hours in a vulnerable position. "Thank God you're here," he said as Sarah climbed out. "We've been sitting ducks all afternoon." "What's the tactical situation?" Rodriguez asked, immediately falling into his role as the senior NCO. "Quiet so far, but we've seen movement in the hills. Could be civilians, could be spotters. Either way, we need to get moving soon." Sarah was already unloading critical supplies from their vehicle. "Medical kit first," she said, handing Williams a large pack filled with antibiotics and surgical equipment. Then ammunition, radios, and emergency rations. The transfer took 20 minutes of intense work. Sarah's organizational skills proved invaluable as she directed the soldiers in loading their smaller vehicle with maximum efficiency. Every cubic inch of space was utilized, and the weight distribution was carefully balanced to maintain vehicle stability. "That's everything critical," she announced as they secured the final load. "The rest can be recovered later." Williams shook hands with each of them. "You probably saved some lives today. We'll make sure Delta gets these supplies tonight." As they prepared to depart, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and pride. The mission had gone exactly as planned. They had successfully delivered critical supplies to soldiers who desperately needed them, and no one had been injured in the process. "Not bad for a supply coordinator," Chun said with a grin as they began the return journey to Blackwater Ridge. Sarah smiled back, but her satisfaction was tempered by awareness of how much danger still surrounded them. The return trip would take them through the same hostile territory, and enemy fighters often used the cover of approaching darkness to launch attacks. "Stay alert," Rodriguez warned, echoing her thoughts. "We're not home yet." The sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. In different circumstances, Sarah might have appreciated the beauty of the landscape. Tonight, the approaching darkness represented increased danger and reduced visibility. They had covered half the distance back to base when Rodriguez suddenly raised his hand in a halt signal. Chun immediately stopped the vehicle, and all 3 soldiers listened intently to the radio traffic filling their headsets. All units, this is Blackwater Ridge Base. We have reports of enemy contact at Forward Operating Base Delta. Ranger Team Alpha is requesting immediate assistance." Sarah's blood ran cold. Ranger Team Alpha was a 12-man special operations unit that had been inserted into the mountains 2 days earlier. They were among the most highly trained soldiers on the base, and if they were calling for help, the situation was serious. "Blackwater Ridge, this is Convoy 77, Rodriguez responded. "We're 15 minutes from Delta's position. What assistance can we provide?" "Stand by, Convoy 77. The radio crackled with overlapping transmissions as the base command center coordinated their response. Sarah could hear the tension in every voice. Somewhere ahead of them, American soldiers were fighting for their lives. "Convoy 77, this is Blackwater Ridge Command." Colonel Hayes' voice cut through the radio chatter. "Ranger Team Alpha has been ambushed in Grid Square 77 Delta. They have casualties and are requesting immediate medical evacuation. All aircraft are committed to other missions." You're the closest friendly unit. Sarah looked at Rodriguez and Chun. Both men had the same expression of grim determination. They were supply personnel and vehicle escorts, not combat troops. But American soldiers needed help, and they were the only ones in position to provide it. Blackwater Ridge, this is Convoy 77, Rodriguez replied steadily. We copy the situation. We have medical supplies on board and are moving to assist. As their vehicle accelerated toward forward operating base Delta, Sarah realized that her carefully planned career in logistics was about to take an unexpected and dangerous turn. In her cargo pockets, she carried inventory lists and supply manifests. In a few minutes, she might be using those same pockets to carry ammunition and medical supplies into combat. The mountains around them seemed to grow darker and more threatening as they raced toward an uncertain fate. Forward operating base Delta appeared ahead of them like a small fortress carved into the mountainside. Concrete barriers surrounded a collection of prefabricated buildings and tents with guard towers positioned at each corner. Normally, the base would have been bustling with activity as soldiers prepared for evening operations. Tonight, it looked eerily quiet. Delta Base, this is Convoy 77 approaching from the south, Rodriguez transmitted as they neared the main gate. Convoy 77, this is Delta Base, came an urgent reply. Proceed directly to the landing zone. Medical personnel are standing by. The guards waved them through without the usual security check. Sarah could see soldiers running between buildings, their faces tight with concentration. The atmosphere was electric with tension and urgency. They pulled up beside a concrete landing pad marked with a large red cross. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the base medical officer, was already waiting with 2 medics and a stretcher team. What's the situation with Ranger Alpha? Rodriguez asked as he and Sarah climbed out of the vehicle. Captain Walsh's expression was grim. 12-man team inserted 48 hours ago for reconnaissance. They discovered a major enemy supply cache and were preparing to call in airstrikes when they got hit. Coordinated ambush from 3 directions. Sarah felt her stomach clench. Casualties, at least 4 wounded, possibly more. Team leader reports they're pinned down in a rocky depression about 2 clicks northeast of here. No air support available for at least 3 hours. Chun was already unloading the medical supplies Sarah had carefully packed hours earlier. What about ground support? Can't Delta send a relief force? Captain Walsh shook her head. We've got 18 men total, and half are out on patrol. Can't leave the base undefended, and the men we have aren't equipped for night operations against entrenched enemies. Sarah studied the tactical map displayed on Captain Walsh's tablet. The terrain between Delta Base and the Rangers' position was a nightmare of rocky ridges and narrow valleys. Perfect country for ambushes, but terrible for rescue operations. Radio contact with the team? She asked. Intermittent. They're conserving battery power and trying to stay quiet. Last report was 10 minutes ago. Team leader says they can hold their position, but they need medical supplies for the wounded. Rodriguez was checking his equipment when the radio crackled with a new transmission. Delta Base, this is Ranger Alpha. The voice was strained but professional. We've got urgent surgical needs here. 1 man with chest trauma, another with severe bleeding from a leg wound. We can't move to you, and we can't wait 3 hours. Captain Walsh grabbed the radio. Ranger Alpha, this is Delta Medical. Can you provide details on the chest trauma? Shrapnel penetration, right side. Breathing is labored but stable. No exit wound visible. The leg wound is mid-thigh, possible arterial involvement. Bleeding is controlled, but he's lost a lot of blood. Sarah listened to the medical discussion while studying the terrain features on the map. Her mind was already working on a logistics problem. How could they get medical supplies to the Rangers quickly and safely? Captain Walsh, she interrupted. How much do these medical supplies weigh? She pointed to the emergency surgical kit they had brought from Blackwater Ridge. Maybe 30 pounds for the full kit. Why? Could a small team move cross-country to reach them? Avoid the roads and approaches where the enemy might be waiting? Walsh considered the idea possible, but extremely dangerous. That's 2 kilometers of rough terrain and darkness, and whoever goes would be walking into an active combat zone. Rodriguez studied the map more carefully. Infantry approach might work. 3 or 4 people, night vision equipment, move slowly and carefully. The Rangers need surgery, not just basic medical supplies, Captain Walsh pointed out. We need to evacuate the wounded back here. Sarah traced a route on the map with her finger. What if we establish a forward medical post here? She indicated a position roughly halfway between Delta Base and the Rangers. Protected location, but closer to them. We could provide advanced treatment, and then evacuate when it's safer. Chen looked up from organizing equipment. That's still a kilometer of movement under fire. Not necessarily, Sarah said, her logistics experience guiding her thinking. If we time it right, coordinate with the Rangers to provide covering fire, we might be able to move during a lull in the fighting. Captain Walsh was already gathering medical equipment. It's risky, but those men are going to die if we wait for air support. Martinez, this was your idea. Are you prepared to help execute it? Sarah felt fear and determination warring in her chest. She had joined the army to serve her country, but she had always imagined doing so from behind a desk or in a warehouse. The thought of moving through hostile territory toward an active firefight terrified her. But somewhere in the darkness, American soldiers were bleeding and dying while she stood in safety. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I'm ready." Rodriguez grabbed her shoulder. "Martinez, you're not trained for this kind of operation." "Neither are you," she replied. "But those Rangers trained all of us, and they need help now." Captain Walsh had made her decision. "We'll take a 4-person team. Me for medical expertise, Rodriguez for security, Martinez because she knows the supply situation better than anyone, and Chen to maintain radio contact with base." As they prepared for the mission, Sarah tried to calm her racing heart by focusing on practical details. She checked her gear methodically. Body armor, helmet, night vision goggles, medical supplies, ammunition. The familiar routine of inventory and preparation helped steady her nerves. "Remember," Rodriguez said as they conducted final equipment checks, "we move slowly and quietly. No unnecessary risks. Our job is to help those Rangers, not create more casualties." The night air was crisp and cold as they departed Delta Base through a hidden exit in the northern perimeter. Sarah had never been outside the wire on foot before, and the sensation was completely different from riding in an armored vehicle. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow potentially dangerous. Chun carried the radio equipment and maintained periodic contact with both Delta Base and Ranger Alpha. Captain Walsh carried the advanced medical supplies, while Rodriguez took point with his M4 rifle and night vision equipment. Sarah carried additional medical supplies and tried to step exactly where Rodriguez had stepped. The terrain was worse than it had appeared on the map. Loose rocks shifted underfoot, and hidden ravines appeared without warning. They moved at what felt like a crawling pace, but Sarah understood the need for caution. One twisted ankle or dislodged stone could compromise the entire mission. "Ranger Alpha, this is medical relief team," Chin whispered into his radio after they had traveled for 30 minutes. "We're approximately 1 kilometer south of your position. Request situation update. Medical relief team, we've had sporadic sniper fire for the past 20 minutes. No direct assaults, but they're definitely still out there. 2 casualties are stable, but need immediate attention." Captain Walsh pressed her lips together in concentration. "Ask them if they can provide covering fire if we get pinned down. Ranger Alpha, can you provide covering fire if needed during our approach?" "Affirmative. We have clear fields of fire to the south and west. Just give us your position when you're ready to move." They continued climbing through the rocky terrain, pausing frequently to listen for signs of enemy activity. Sarah's legs burned from the unaccustomed effort, and sweat soaked her uniform despite the cool night air. The medical pack felt heavier with each step, but she refused to complain. "Movement ahead," Rodriguez whispered, raising his fist in a halt signal. They froze among a cluster of large boulders, straining to see and hear anything unusual. Sarah's heart hammered so loudly she was certain enemies would hear it from hundreds of yards away. After several tense minutes, Rodriguez relaxed slightly. Animal, probably a fox or wild dog. They resumed their approach, now less than half a kilometer from the Rangers' position. The sound of distant gunfire had been sporadic but consistent, indicating that the battle was still ongoing. "Medical relief team, this is Ranger Alpha," the radio crackled softly. "We can see muzzle flashes from your approximate direction. Is that you?" Chen checked his GPS device. "Negative, Ranger Alpha. We're still 400 meters south of you. Muzzle flashes are probably enemy positions." The implications hit Sarah immediately. They were walking directly toward enemy fighters who were actively engaged with the Rangers. The smart thing would be to find a safe position and wait for daylight or air support. But the Rangers couldn't wait. According to Captain Walsh's medical assessment, the wounded soldiers would likely die from blood loss or infection if they didn't receive proper treatment within the next few hours. "We keep moving," Captain Walsh decided. Slow and careful. As they climbed higher into the rocky terrain, the sounds of battle became clearer. Sarah could distinguish between the sharp crack of American M4 rifles and the deeper sound of AK-47s used by insurgent forces. Occasionally, she saw brief muzzle flashes in the darkness ahead. "There," Rodriguez pointed to a depression surrounded by large boulders about 200 meters ahead. "That's got to be them." Even with night vision equipment, it was difficult to make out details in the rocky terrain. Sarah could see movement among the boulders, but couldn't distinguish between friendly and enemy forces. "Ranger Alpha, this is medical relief team," Chen transmitted. "We're approximately 200 meters south of your position. We need marking to identify your location. Stand by for infrared signal." A moment later, Sarah saw a brief infrared strobe through her night vision goggles. The signal came from the boulder-lined depression Rodriguez had identified. "Contact confirmed," she whispered. But as they prepared to move toward the Rangers' position, Sarah noticed more movement in the rocks between them and their destination. Dark shapes were moving carefully among the boulders, and they weren't using American tactical formations. "Enemy fighters," Rodriguez breathed. "At least 6, maybe more. They're trying to get closer to the Rangers." Sarah felt ice-cold fear flood her system. They had walked directly into the middle of an active battle, with enemy forces between them and the soldiers they were trying to help. "What do we do?" Chen asked. Captain Walsh studied the tactical situation through her night vision equipment. "We can't reach the Rangers directly. Too many enemy fighters in the way." Rodriguez was already thinking tactically. "We need to create a distraction. Draw some of those fighters away from the Rangers' position." 4 people against unknown numbers of enemy fighters? Sarah asked. "That sounds like suicide." "Not necessarily," Rodriguez replied. "If we can get behind them, create noise and confusion, they might think they're facing a larger force." Captain Walsh shook her head. "Too risky. We should call for support." "Ma'am, those Rangers are going to die if we wait," Rodriguez insisted. "We're here now. We have to try." Sarah looked at the medical supplies she carried, then at the enemy fighters moving through the darkness toward American soldiers. Everything in her training told her to find a safe position and wait for proper support. But her conscience wouldn't let her abandon wounded soldiers when she was the only help available. "Sergeant Rodriguez is right," she said quietly. "We have to try." Captain Walsh studied each of them in the green glow of night vision equipment. "All right, here's what we'll do." The plan was simple and dangerous. Rodriguez and Chen would circle to the east and create a distraction to draw enemy fighters away from the Rangers. Captain Walsh and Sarah would use the confusion to reach the wounded soldiers and begin emergency medical treatment. "Once we start this, there's no going back," Rodriguez warned. Everyone stays calm, follows the plan, and trusts each other. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Medical supplies, extra ammunition, radio gear. In a few minutes, she would be running toward enemy gunfire instead of away from it. As they prepared to separate, Captain Walsh grabbed Sarah's arm. "You sure about this, Martinez? No one will think less of you if you want to wait here." Sarah looked toward the Rangers' position, where American soldiers were fighting for their lives. "Those men need help, ma'am. I'm not leaving without giving them everything I can." Rodriguez and Chin disappeared into the darkness, moving east toward the enemy positions. Sarah and Captain Walsh began a slow, careful approach toward the Rangers, staying low among the rocks and pausing frequently to listen. "Medical relief team, this is Ranger Alpha," the radio whispered. "We see 4 enemy fighters moving toward our position from the south. Are you in contact?" "Negative," Captain Walsh replied. "We're approaching from the southwest. Stand by for distraction from the east." Gunfire erupted from the eastern side of the battlefield as Rodriguez and Chin opened fire on enemy positions. Immediately, Sarah could see muzzle flashes as insurgent fighters turned to face this new threat. "Go," Captain Walsh whispered. They ran forward, stumbling over loose rocks and dodging between boulders. Gunfire crashed around them from multiple directions, and Sarah could hear bullets ricocheting off stone surfaces. Her legs felt weak with terror, but she forced herself to keep moving toward the Rangers' position. "American medics coming in," Captain Walsh shouted as they approached the final line of boulders. Come on," a voice called back. Strong hands pulled Sarah into the rocky depression where Ranger Alpha had established their defensive position. She found herself surrounded by elite soldiers who looked like they had been through hell. "Thank God you're here," said a sergeant with a blood-stained uniform. "We've got 2 critical casualties and 4 more with various wounds." Sarah immediately began unpacking medical supplies, while Captain Walsh conducted quick assessments of the wounded. The story she had heard on the radio hadn't prepared her for the reality of seeing severely injured soldiers. The soldier with chest trauma was unconscious, breathing laboriously through blood-stained lips. The man with the leg wound was pale from blood loss, but still conscious and alert. "I can stabilize them here, but we need to get them to proper surgical facilities," Captain Walsh said as she began emergency treatment. "Not going to be easy," the Ranger sergeant replied. "We're surrounded, and they're not letting up." As if to emphasize his point, enemy gunfire intensified from multiple directions. Rodriguez and Chen had succeeded in drawing some fighters away, but plenty remained to keep the Rangers pinned down. Sarah organized medical supplies with practiced efficiency, while Captain Walsh worked to save lives. In this chaos of battle, her logistics skills proved more valuable than ever. She anticipated what the captain needed and had it ready before being asked. "Bleeding is controlled on both critical cases," Captain Walsh announced after 20 minutes of intense work. "But we need evacuation within the next hour." The Ranger sergeant studied the tactical situation. "Helicopter landing zone is 800 meters west, but it's completely exposed. We'd have to fight our way there." "What about air support?" Sarah asked. "Still 90 minutes out." Sarah looked at the wounded soldiers, then at the defensive position around them. 2 men needed immediate surgery, and 4 others required treatment that could only be provided at a proper medical facility. They were trapped in a circle of enemy fighters with no clear way to reach safety. But giving up wasn't an option. These Rangers had risked their lives on a mission to protect other soldiers. Now, it was her turn to take risks to protect them. "What if we create our own landing zone?" she suggested. "Something closer and more defensible." The Ranger sergeant looked at her with new interest. "What do you have in mind?" Sarah pulled out her map and studied the terrain features around their position. "There's a flat area about 200 meters north, still exposed but less than the main LZ. If we could clear enemy fighters from that sector." "That's a big if," the sergeant replied. "We need to coordinate multiple moving parts." Captain Walsh looked up from treating patients. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it soon." These men are stable for now, but their condition could deteriorate rapidly. Gunfire continued to echo through the rocky terrain as enemy and American forces traded shots in the darkness. Rodriguez and Chen were still creating havoc among enemy positions, but Sarah knew they couldn't maintain that level of intensity indefinitely. As she studied the tactical map, Sarah realized that her greatest challenge as a supply coordinator was just beginning. She had to figure out how to move wounded soldiers, medical equipment, and a medical team through hostile territory to reach safety. It was the ultimate logistics problem, with lives hanging in the balance. The Ranger Sergeant, whose name tag read Harrison, studied Sarah's proposed landing zone through his night vision scope. It could work, but we need to neutralize at least 3 enemy positions to create a clear corridor. Sarah traced potential routes on her map, while Captain Walsh continued treating the wounded. What about Rodriguez and Chun? Can they provide support from their position? Maybe, Harrison replied, but they're already engaged with multiple hostiles. We can't count on them for much more. The soldier with the chest wound began coughing up blood, and Captain Walsh's expression grew more urgent. We're running out of time. His lung is collapsing, and I can only do so much with field equipment. Sarah looked around at the Rangers in their defensive positions. These were some of the most highly trained soldiers in the world, but they were outnumbered and surrounded. The wounded couldn't be moved until the evacuation route was secured, but they couldn't secure the route without exposing themselves to concentrated enemy fire. How many Rangers are still combat effective? She asked Harrison. 7, including myself. 3 more with minor wounds who can still fight if necessary. Sarah did quick calculations in her head. 10 Rangers plus herself, Captain Walsh, and possibly Rodriguez, and Chen if they could disengage from their current position. 13 people to move 2 critical casualties and secure a landing zone against unknown numbers of enemy fighters. What's the enemy strength? She asked. Hard to say in this terrain. We've identified at least 15 distinct firing positions, but there could be more. They hit us with everything they had during the initial ambush. A new voice crackled over the radio. Ranger Alpha, this is Eagle Flight. We're inbound to your area with close air support. Estimated time of arrival, 45 minutes. Harrison grabbed his radio. Eagle Flight, this is Ranger Alpha. We have multiple wounded requiring immediate evacuation. Can you provide helicopter support? Ranger Alpha, we're configured for close air support, not medical evacuation. We can clear enemy positions, but you'll need to arrange your own medical transport. Sarah felt frustration building. Air support could eliminate enemy fighters, but wouldn't solve the evacuation problem. The wounded soldiers needed to reach a hospital, not just a clear battlefield. Delta Base, this is Ranger Alpha, Harrison transmitted. Request immediate medical evacuation helicopter to our position. Ranger Alpha, this is Delta Base. Medical evacuation is available, but pilot requires secured landing zone. Enemy air defense assets reported in your area. Captain Walsh looked up from her patients. We're going in circles. Someone has to take the initiative to break this deadlock. Sarah studied the tactical situation one more time. Enemy fighters controlled the high ground around their position, making conventional evacuation impossible. Air support could clear some positions, but not all of them. A ground assault against entrenched enemies would likely result in additional casualties. But there was another option, one that played to her strengths as a logistics coordinator. What if we don't move the patients to the landing zone? She suggested. What if we bring the landing zone to them? Harrison frowned. I don't follow. Sarah pointed to a relatively flat area just 50 meters north of their current position. It's not ideal for helicopter operations, but it might be big enough for a medical evacuation bird. If we can clear just one sector instead of a whole corridor. That's still a lot of enemy fighters to neutralize, Harrison pointed out. Not necessarily, Sarah replied, her mind racing through possibilities. What if we use deception instead of direct confrontation? She pulled out her inventory list and began checking supplies. Emergency flares, smoke grenades, noisemakers, even some pyrotechnic devices intended for training exercises. Items she had packed automatically without considering their tactical applications. "What are you thinking?" Captain Walsh asked. "Misdirection," Sarah explained. "Make the enemy think we're attempting evacuation from the original landing zone while actually using the closer position." Harrison considered the idea. Create a diversion to draw fighters away from our actual evacuation point. Exactly. Use our limited resources to maximum effect. The plan began taking shape as they discussed details. Rodriguez and Chen would continue their harassment of eastern positions while setting up pyrotechnic displays to simulate a large force preparing the main landing zone. The Rangers would create similar displays to the west, making enemy fighters believe evacuation would occur from that direction. Meanwhile, the actual medical evacuation would take place from the small area north of their position. It was risky and required precise timing, but it offered a chance of success without direct assault against superior numbers. It could work, Harrison agreed, but we'll get one chance. If the deception fails, we'll be completely exposed. Captain Walsh had been listening while monitoring her patients. The soldier with the chest trauma won't survive another hour without proper surgery. We have to try something. Sarah began organizing the supplies needed for their deception operation. Flares, smoke generators, noise makers, even spare radio equipment they could use to simulate larger forces. Her logistics training had taught her to think creatively about resource utilization, and tonight that skill might save lives. "Delta Base, this is Ranger Alpha," Harrison transmitted. "We're going to attempt evacuation from alternate landing zone. Request medical helicopter standing by." "Ranger Alpha, this is Delta Base. Medical helicopter is on station 5 minutes south of your position. Pilot needs 3 minutes advance notice for final approach." Harrison checked his watch. "Eagle flight ETA is 30 minutes. We start the deception in 20 minutes, which gives us a 10-minute window for evacuation before air support arrives." Sarah felt nervous energy building as they prepared for the operation. She had never been involved in anything remotely like combat deception, but the principles weren't entirely different from managing complex supply operations. Success depended on careful planning, precise timing, and flawless execution. "Remember," Harrison told his Rangers, "this only works if the enemy believes we're really trying to use the main landing zone. Make it look convincing." Rodriguez's voice came over the radio. "Ranger Alpha, this is Distraction Team. We're in position and ready to begin fireworks display. Copy, Distraction Team. Stand by for execute signal." The Rangers began moving into position for their part of the deception. Sarah helped Captain Walsh prepare the wounded for rapid evacuation, ensuring all medical equipment was ready for quick transport. "You realize we're completely exposed during the evacuation?" Captain Walsh said quietly. "If this doesn't work, we'll be sitting ducks." Sarah nodded. "I know, but sitting here, waiting, isn't working either." The soldier with the chest wound went into respiratory distress, and Captain Walsh had to perform emergency procedures to keep him breathing. Time was running out faster than they had anticipated. "Execute, execute, execute," Harrison whispered into his radio. Immediately, pyrotechnics began exploding around the main landing zone 800 meters away. Rodriguez and Chen triggered a series of flares and smoke generators that created the illusion of a large force preparing the area for helicopter operations. The Rangers added to the deception by firing toward enemy positions from directions that suggested movement toward the main landing zone. Within minutes, Sarah could see muzzle flashes as enemy fighters began concentrating their efforts on the false evacuation site. "It's working," Harrison breathed. "Enemy fire is shifting away from our position." Sarah checked her watch. They had approximately 8 minutes before air support arrived and complicated the tactical situation. The medical helicopter needed to approach, land, load patients, and depart before enemy fighters realized they had been deceived. "Delta Base, this is Ranger Alpha," Harrison transmitted. "Request immediate medical evacuation at alternate landing zone. We have green smoke marking the position. Ranger Alpha, this is Dustoff 7-3. I'm beginning my approach. Mark the landing zone now. Harrison triggered a green smoke grenade that billowed up from their hastily cleared landing area. The smoke would help the pilot locate them, but it would also reveal their position to any enemy fighters who happen to be watching. I can see your smoke, the pilot reported. Coming in fast and low. Have your patients ready for immediate loading. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder as the medical aircraft approached through the darkness. Sarah helped Captain Walsh prepare the 2 critical casualties for transport, ensuring all medical equipment was secured and ready. 30 seconds, the pilot announced. Sarah could see the helicopter now, running without navigation lights as it approached their position. The pilot was flying dangerously low to avoid enemy detection, using the rocky terrain for cover. But as the aircraft began its final approach, muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions around their defensive perimeter. Enemy fighters had realized the deception and were concentrating fire on the actual landing zone. Taking fire, the pilot reported. I'm going around. The helicopter pulled up sharply and disappeared back into the darkness, leaving them exactly where they had started. The deception had worked temporarily, but not long enough to complete the evacuation. Ranger Alpha, this is Dustoff 7-3, the pilot transmitted. I can't land with that much ground fire. You need to suppress those positions. Harrison checked his ammunition supply. We don't have enough firepower to clear all those positions. Sarah looked at the tactical situation and realized they needed a different approach. Direct suppression wasn't working, and time was running out. The wounded soldiers needed evacuation immediately. But looking at her remaining supplies, Sarah had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if we don't suppress the enemy positions, she suggested. What if we eliminate them? Harrison stared at her. With what? We're outnumbered 3-1. Sarah pulled out a detailed inventory list and began checking items. How much explosive ordnance are we carrying? Standard load. Fragmentation grenades, maybe some demo charges. What about in the helicopter medical kit? Captain Walsh frowned. Medical supplies don't include explosives. No, but they include oxygen tanks. Pressurized containers that could be turned into improvised explosive devices. The idea was taking shape in Sarah's mind. Her logistics background had taught her to think creatively about available resources. Oxygen tanks weren't weapons, but in the right circumstances, they could be turned into effective area denial devices. You're talking about improvised demolitions, Harrison said. That's extremely dangerous. More dangerous than letting these soldiers die. Sarah asked. Captain Walsh looked up from monitoring her patients. The chest trauma case is deteriorating rapidly. We're out of time for conventional solutions. Harrison studied Sarah's proposal. It was risky and unconventional, but it offered a chance of eliminating enough enemy positions to allow helicopter evacuation. All right, he decided, but I'm not sending untrained personnel to place improvised explosives. That's a job for rangers. Sarah shook her head. You need every ranger here to provide covering fire and security. I can place the devices. Martinez, you're not trained for combat demolitions. No, but I am trained in handling hazardous materials and understanding explosive safety procedures. And I know exactly where those enemy positions are based on their muzzle flashes. Harrison considered the arguments while enemy gunfire continued around their position. Rodriguez and Chen were still creating diversions, but their ammunition wouldn't last much longer. If we're going to do this, it has to be now, Captain Walsh said urgently. My patient won't survive another delay. Sarah was already gathering the materials she needed. Medical oxygen tanks, electrical components from damaged radio equipment, and improvised timing devices made from emergency flares. It wasn't sophisticated, but it might be effective enough to clear enemy positions. Give me 5 minutes to reach the target positions, she told Harrison. Then call in a helicopter for immediate evacuation. Martinez, this is suicide. Sarah looked at the wounded Rangers, then at Captain Walsh working desperately to keep them alive. Maybe, but doing nothing is definitely suicide for these soldiers. Harrison made his decision. All right, but you take Peterson with you for security. Ranger Peterson was a young soldier from Minnesota who had been wounded in the initial ambush but remained combat effective. He checked his rifle and ammunition while Sarah finished assembling her improvised explosives. You sure about this? Peterson asked as they prepared to move. Sarah felt terror and determination fighting for control of her emotions. Everything in her training told her to find a safe position and wait for proper support. But her conscience wouldn't let her abandon wounded soldiers when action was possible. I'm sure, she replied, checking her equipment one final time. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of a defensive position, Sarah realized that her career as a supply coordinator had led to this moment in ways she could never have anticipated. All those hours organizing equipment, understanding material properties, and coordinating complex logistics had prepared her for the most dangerous mission of her life. The wounded soldiers were depending on her ability to turn medical supplies into weapons and eliminate enemy positions that professional soldiers couldn't reach. It was time to find out if a supply coordinator could also be a warrior. Sarah and Peterson crawled through the rocky terrain toward the first enemy position, moving slowly to avoid detection. The improvised explosive devices Sarah had created were crude, but potentially effective. Each device consisted of a medical oxygen tank with electrical detonators made from radio components and timing mechanisms improvised from emergency flares. First position is about 50 meters ahead, Peterson whispered, checking his night vision scope. I count at least 3 fighters. Sarah studied the terrain between their current location and the enemy position. Large boulders provided cover for most of the approach, but the final 20 meters would be completely exposed. I need to get close enough to place the device where it will be effective, she said quietly. Maybe 15 meters from their position. Peterson shook his head. Too dangerous. If they spot you during placement, you're dead. If I don't get close enough, the device won't be effective enough to eliminate the position. They continued moving forward, using every piece of cover available. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as they approached the enemy fighters. She could hear voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize, and occasionally caught glimpses of movement among the rocks. There, Peterson pointed to a cluster of boulders positioned perfectly for an ambush site. That's where they're set up. Sarah studied the position through her night vision equipment. The enemy fighters had chosen their location well, with excellent fields of fire and multiple escape routes. A frontal assault would be extremely costly, even with superior numbers. But they weren't attempting a frontal assault. Sarah's plan relied on surprise and overwhelming explosive force to eliminate the position before the occupants could react. I'm going to circle around to the east, she told Peterson. Give me 10 minutes to get into position, then create a distraction to draw their attention. What kind of distraction? Nothing dramatic. Maybe throw a rock in the opposite direction. Just enough to make them look away for 30 seconds. Peterson checked his watch. 10 minutes, starting now. Sarah began crawling through the darkness, moving carefully to avoid dislodging loose stones that might alert enemy sentries. The improvised explosive device felt heavy and awkward in her pack, and she constantly worried that the crude detonation mechanism might malfunction. Her logistics training had included basic instruction in handling hazardous materials, but nothing had prepared her for creating weapons from medical supplies. She was operating on intuition and hope, trying to apply engineering principles she barely understood. The eastern approach to the enemy position took her through a narrow ravine filled with loose rocks and thorny bushes. Every movement seemed to create noise that would surely alert enemy fighters, but somehow she remained undetected. Position established, she whispered into her radio when she reached a point approximately 20 meters from the target. Copy, Peterson replied, creating distraction in 30 seconds. Sarah removed the improvised explosive from her pack and checked the timing mechanism one final time. The device was designed to detonate 30 seconds after activation, which would give her just enough time to retreat to minimum safe distance. A rock clattered in the darkness west of the enemy position. Immediately, Sarah heard movement and voices as the fighters turned their attention toward the noise. This was her opportunity. She sprinted forward through the darkness, covering the exposed ground between her hiding place and the optimal placement position. 20 meters felt like 20 miles as she stumbled over loose rocks and dodged between boulders. The enemy fighters were still focused on the western approach when Sarah reached the optimal placement position. She activated the timing mechanism and placed the device behind a large rock that would direct most of the explosive force toward the enemy position. 30 seconds to minimum safe distance. Sarah turned and ran back toward her concealment position, no longer worried about noise discipline. Speed was more important than stealth now. If the enemy fighters spotted her, they would have enough time to escape the blast radius. 20 seconds. She dove behind a cluster of boulders and pressed herself against the stone surface. The improvised explosive device might be more powerful than she had calculated, and she wasn't certain about the minimum safe distance. 10 seconds. Fire in the hole, she whispered in her radio, warning Peterson and the Rangers about the impending explosion. 5 seconds. Sarah pressed her hands against her ears and opened her mouth to equalize pressure from the blast wave. The explosion was much larger than she had anticipated. The medical oxygen tank detonated with tremendous force, sending chunks of rock flying through the air like shrapnel. The sound echoed off the surrounding mountains, momentarily drowning out all other battle noise. When the debris stopped falling, Sarah cautiously looked toward the enemy position. Where there had been organized fighting positions, she now saw scattered rocks and no signs of movement. Target eliminated, she reported to Peterson. Jesus Christ, Martinez Peterson replied. That was one hell of an explosion. But there was no time to celebrate. They had 2 more enemy positions to neutralize before the helicopter could attempt another evacuation. Sarah checked her remaining improvised explosives and prepared to move toward the second target. Ranger Alpha, this is Eagle Flight, the radio crackled. We heard that explosion from 10 kilometers away. What's your situation? Harrison responded immediately. Eagle Flight, we're conducting demolition operations to clear enemy positions for medical evacuation. Copy that. We're standing by for close air support if needed. Sarah and Peterson were already moving toward the second enemy position, located approximately 100 meters northeast of the first. This position commanded excellent fields of fire over their improvised landing zone and would have to be eliminated before helicopter evacuation could succeed. The approach to the second position was more difficult than the first. The terrain offered less cover, and the enemy fighters had been alerted by the explosion. Sarah could see movement among the rocks as the fighters repositioned themselves for better defensive positions. They know we're coming, Peterson observed. This won't be as easy as the first one. Sarah studied the tactical situation through her night vision equipment. The enemy fighters had spread out among multiple rock formations, making it impossible to eliminate all of them with a single explosive device. What if we don't try to eliminate them? She suggested. What if we just suppress them long enough for evacuation? Peterson considered the idea. Ow! Sarah checked her remaining supplies. 2 more improvised explosive devices, plus several smoke grenades and emergency flares. Not enough to destroy the position, but possibly enough to create confusion and temporary suppression. Smoke and noise, she said, create enough confusion that they can't effectively engage the helicopter during evacuation. That might work, but timing will be critical. Sarah activated her radio. Ranger Alpha, this is Demolition Team. Request immediate helicopter evacuation. We can suppress enemy positions for approximately 3 minutes. Copy, Demolition Team. Dustoff 7-3, this is Ranger Alpha. We're ready for immediate evacuation. Landing zone will be marked with green smoke. Ranger Alpha, this is Dustoff 7-3. Beginning final approach. Have your patients ready for immediate loading. Sarah and Peterson moved into position to begin their suppression operation. The plan was to use smoke grenades to obscure enemy vision, while the improvised explosive devices created noise and confusion. It wasn't sophisticated, but it might provide enough distraction for helicopter operations. Execute suppression, Sarah whispered into her radio. Peterson triggered multiple smoke grenades around the enemy position, while Sarah activated her remaining explosive devices with extended timing mechanisms. Within seconds, thick smoke began billowing through the rocky terrain, reducing visibility to nearly zero. The first improvised explosive detonated with a tremendous crash, followed 20 seconds later by the second. The combination of smoke and explosions created exactly the kind of chaos Sarah had hoped for. I can see the landing zone, the helicopter pilot reported. Beginning final approach. Through her night vision equipment, Sarah could see the medical helicopter approaching fast and low. The pilot was taking enormous risks, flying through potentially hostile airspace with limited visibility and no escort. Touching down now, the pilot announced. Sarah watched as Captain Walsh and the Rangers quickly loaded their wounded comrades into the helicopter. The operation took less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours as enemy fighters began to recover from the confusion and resume accurate fire. Patients loaded, Captain Walsh reported. We're ready for departure. Lifting off, the pilot announced. The helicopter rose from the improvised landing zone and disappeared into the darkness, carrying the wounded Rangers to proper medical facilities. Sarah felt a surge of relief and accomplishment as she watched the aircraft fade from view. Dustoff 7-3 clear of the area, the pilot reported. Thank for the assist, ground teams. But their mission wasn't complete yet. Sarah, Peterson, Rodriguez, and Chin still had to extract themselves from hostile territory and return to safety. Enemy fighters were regrouping and would likely attempt to track down the soldiers responsible for the successful evacuation. Demolition team, this is Ranger Alpha, Harrison transmitted. Outstanding work. Now we need to get you out of there. Sarah checked her remaining supplies. No more explosives, limited ammunition, and enemy fighters who were undoubtedly angry about the successful evacuation operation. What's the extraction plan? She asked Peterson. We move back to the original position and wait for air support, he replied. Eagle flight should be overhead in about 15 minutes. They began moving carefully through the rocky terrain, avoiding areas where enemy fighters might have regrouped. The smoke from Sarah's devices was beginning to clear, improving visibility, but also making concealment more difficult. Movement to the south, Peterson reported, spotting enemy fighters attempting to cut off their retreat route. Sarah studied the tactical situation through her night vision equipment. At least 6 enemy fighters were moving to intercept their withdrawal, and more might be following. We need a different route, she said, checking her map for alternative approaches to the Rangers' position. What about moving north and circling back? Sarah traced potential routes on her map. A northern approach would take them through more difficult terrain, but might avoid enemy patrols. Worth a try, she agreed. They changed direction and began climbing through increasingly rocky terrain. The northern route was more demanding physically, but offered better concealment from enemy observation. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio. Demolition team, this is distraction team. We've got multiple enemy fighters moving toward your last known position. Copy, distraction team. We're moving north to avoid contact. Roger that. We'll continue harassment operations to keep them busy. The sound of gunfire echoed through the mountains as Rodriguez and Chin engaged enemy forces, drawing attention away from Sarah and Peterson's withdrawal route. Those guys are taking major risks to help us, Peterson observed as they climbed through a particularly difficult section of terrain. Sarah nodded, feeling deep appreciation for the courage and professionalism of all the soldiers involved in the operation. Everyone had performed beyond normal expectations to save the lives of wounded Rangers. Eagle Flight, this is Ranger Alpha, Harrison transmitted. Request close air support on enemy positions around Grid Square 77 Delta. Ranger Alpha, this is Eagle Flight. We have visual on multiple enemy positions. Beginning attack runs now. The sound of jet engines roared overhead as air support finally arrived. Within minutes, the mountainside erupted in explosions as precision-guided munitions eliminated enemy fighting positions. Target area is clear, Eagle Flight reported. All ground units are clear to move. Sarah and Peterson emerged from their concealment and began moving more quickly toward the Rangers' position. With air support overhead and enemy positions neutralized, the immediate danger had passed. Demolition team, this is Ranger Alpha, Harrison transmitted. Outstanding mission. Return to base position for extraction. As they approached the Rangers' defensive position, Sarah felt exhaustion beginning to replace adrenaline. The past several hours have been the most intense and dangerous of her life, but they had succeeded in saving wounded soldiers who would otherwise have died. Martinez, Harrison said as they reached safety, that was some of the most creative problem-solving I've ever seen in combat. Sarah looked at the scattered remains of her improvised explosive devices and the medical supplies she had converted into weapons. Her logistics training had prepared her for this mission in ways she could never have anticipated. Just doing my job, Sergeant, she replied, though both of them knew this had been far beyond any normal job description. As helicopters arrived to extract the team back to base, Sarah reflected on how much her role had changed in a single night. She had begun the day as a supply coordinator focused on spreadsheets and inventory management. She was ending it as a combat veteran who had eliminated enemy positions and saved the lives of wounded Rangers using nothing but creativity, determination, and improvised weapons made from medical supplies. The transformation was complete, but the real test would be how she handled the aftermath of her actions. The extraction helicopters touched down at Blackwater Ridge just as the sun began rising over the eastern mountains. Sarah climbed out of the aircraft on unsteady legs, her uniform torn and stained with dirt, sweat, and dried blood from treating wounded soldiers. The familiar sights of the base looked strange after the night's events, as if she was seeing everything through different eyes. Captain Morrison was waiting on the landing pad with Colonel Hayes and several other senior officers. Their expressions ranged from concerned to amazed as they took in the returning team's appearance. Martinez, Colonel Hayes said as Sarah approached, I understand you had an eventful night. Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. The events of the past 12 hours felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. Yes, ma'am. We were able to evacuate the wounded Rangers successfully. So I heard. Sergeant Harrison provided a preliminary report that raises some interesting questions about your actions. Sarah felt her stomach clench. Had she violated regulations by creating improvised explosive devices? Were there legal consequences for her unconventional tactics? Ma'am, if I exceeded my authority or violated procedures. Colonel Hayes held up a hand. Martinez, you're not in trouble, but we need a detailed debrief about exactly what happened out there. The debriefing took place in the base command center, with Sarah providing a minute-by-minute account of the night's events to a room full of senior officers and intelligence personnel. She described the initial convoy breakdown, the decision to assist the Rangers, and the improvised explosive devices she had created from medical supplies. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Major Brooks said when she finished her account. You converted medical oxygen tanks into area denial weapons using components from damaged radio equipment? Yes, sir. The tanks were pressurized containers that could be turned into effective explosive devices with proper timing mechanisms. And you had no formal training in demolitions or combat engineering? Sarah shook her head. No, sir. Just basic hazardous materials handling and logistics training. The room was quiet for several moments as the officers absorbed her account. Sarah couldn't tell whether they were impressed or concerned about her improvised tactics. Martinez, Colonel Hayes finally, said, "Your actions last night saved the lives of at least 2 Rangers who would have died without immediate medical evacuation. Your creative problem-solving under extreme pressure demonstrated exceptional initiative and courage." Sarah felt relief flooding through her system. "Thank you, ma'am." However, the colonel continued, "Your methods were highly unconventional and potentially dangerous. Converting medical equipment into explosive devices is not something we can officially recommend or endorse." Major Brooks leaned forward in his chair. "That said, combat situations sometimes require unconventional solutions. Your logistics background gave you a unique perspective on available resources." Over the following weeks, Sarah's story spread throughout the military community. The account of a supply coordinator who had eliminated enemy positions with improvised explosives made from medical supplies became legendary among soldiers deployed in Afghanistan. "You're famous," Sergeant Rodriguez told her one morning as they organized a supply shipment. "I heard Rangers at 3 different bases talking about the supply coordinator who became a one-woman demolition team." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention. "I was just doing what needed to be done." Maybe, but not everyone would have thought of using oxygen tanks as weapons. That took real creativity. The wounded Rangers she had helped evacuate all survived their injuries and eventually returned to duty. Staff Sergeant Williams, the soldier with chest trauma, visited Blackwater Ridge specifically to thank her for saving his life. "The doctor said I wouldn't have made it another hour without proper surgery," he told her during their meeting. "What you did out there was incredible." Sarah was promoted to staff sergeant and received a Bronze Star for valor, though she remained assigned to supply operations at her own request. The base command recognized that her logistics expertise was too valuable to reassign to a different specialty. "You've proven that support personnel can be just as heroic as combat troops," Captain Morrison said during the promotion ceremony. "Your actions demonstrate that courage and creativity matter more than job classification." But the experience changed Sarah in ways that went beyond military recognition. She found herself thinking differently about her role as a supply coordinator, viewing each shipment and inventory decision through the lens of potential combat applications. Every piece of equipment we handle could potentially save lives in ways we never anticipated, she explained to new soldiers assigned to the supply depot. "Understanding the properties and capabilities of your materials is just as important as knowing the quantities." She began developing training programs that taught other supply personnel to think creatively about resource utilization. Her courses covered everything from basic field medicine to improvised engineering, preparing logistics soldiers for situations that might require unconventional solutions. "The traditional military approach is to use weapons for fighting and medical supplies for healing," she told one class. "But in reality, the distinction isn't always that clear. Understanding the fundamental properties of your materials allows you to adapt to changing situations." Sarah's innovative training methods caught the attention of senior military leaders, and she was eventually invited to present her ideas at the Army Logistics University. Her lecture on creative resource utilization in combat environments became required curriculum for all logistics officers. The Martinez method, as it came to be known, emphasized understanding the underlying properties and capabilities of all available materials, rather than limiting thinking to conventional applications. The approach proved valuable in numerous subsequent operations. 6 months after the Ranger Rescue operation, Sarah received an assignment to the Pentagon, where she was tasked with developing new logistics doctrines based on her experiences in Afghanistan. The transition from field operations to policy development represented another major change in her career trajectory. "You've gone from managing inventory to shaping how the entire Army thinks about logistics," General Patricia Coleman told her during an orientation briefing. "Your experiences in Afghanistan provide insights that couldn't be gained in any classroom." Sarah's new position involved analyzing combat operations from around the world and identifying opportunities for improved logistics support. She worked with teams of officers and civilian analysts to develop new procedures that emphasize creativity and adaptability. Traditional logistics focuses on delivering the right supplies to the right place at the right time, she explained during a briefing to senior Pentagon officials. But modern warfare requires logistics personnel who can also improvise solutions when conventional supplies aren't available or sufficient. Her work led to the development of new training programs that prepared logistics soldiers for the kind of creative problem-solving she had demonstrated during the Ranger Rescue. The programs emphasized understanding material properties, basic engineering principles, and adaptability under pressure. Every supply sergeant should understand that a medical oxygen tank is also a potential explosive device, became one of the key principles in the new training curriculum. Not because we want them making bombs, but because understanding all the properties of your materials makes you a more effective problem solver. Sarah's innovations attracted attention from other military services and allied nations. She found herself traveling internationally to share her methods with logistics professionals from around the world. The principles apply regardless of equipment or nationality, she told a gathering of NATO logistics officers in Brussels. Creative thinking and thorough understanding of available resources are universal assets. 3 years after the events in Afghanistan, Sarah was promoted to major and assigned to lead a new Army research division focused on innovative logistics solutions. Her team included engineers, scientists, and experienced field personnel who worked together to develop new approaches to supply chain management in combat environments. We're not trying to replace conventional logistics, she explained to her team during their first meeting. We're trying to expand the toolkit available to field personnel when conventional approaches aren't sufficient. The research division's first major project involved developing standardized procedures for converting common supply items into emergency tools and equipment. Sarah's team created detailed guides that showed logistics personnel how to improvise everything from communication equipment to medical devices using readily available materials. The goal isn't to encourage reckless experimentation, she told military reporters covering the project. It's to ensure that our people have options when they face unexpected challenges. Sarah's personal life had also been transformed by her experiences. She married Rodriguez, who had left the Army to pursue a degree in engineering. Their relationship had been strengthened by their shared experiences during the Ranger Rescue operation. I always knew you were special, he told her during their wedding ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. But I never imagined you'd become famous for turning medical supplies into weapons. They settled in Virginia, where Sarah continued her work at the Pentagon while Rodriguez completed his education. Their home became a gathering place for veterans who had served with them in Afghanistan, maintaining the bonds forged during their deployment. Those experiences shaped all of us, Captain Walsh, now a civilian emergency room physician, said during one reunion gathering. But Sarah took those lessons and turned them into something that helps soldiers everywhere. The wounded Rangers Sarah had helped save became regular attendees at these gatherings. Staff Sergeant Williams, now fully recovered and serving as an instructor at Ranger School, often spoke about how the experience had changed his perspective on support personnel. I used to think of logistics people as rear echelon troops who never faced real danger, he admitted during one gathering. Now I understand that anyone serving in a combat zone can become a warrior when the situation demands it. Sarah's story became part of official Army training materials, used to illustrate the importance of creative thinking and initiative in military operations. Her actions during the Ranger Rescue were studied in leadership courses and logistics schools around the world. The Martinez Incident, as it became known in military education circles, demonstrated that effective military service wasn't limited to traditional combat roles. Support personnel who understood their capabilities and remained committed to the mission could make decisive contributions in unexpected ways. 10 years after the events in Afghanistan, Sarah was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to command a logistics brigade preparing for deployment to a new conflict zone. Her unit incorporated all the lessons learned from her earlier experiences, training soldiers to think creatively about resource utilization while maintaining focus on their primary missions. "We're not combat engineers or demolition specialists," she told her soldiers during pre-deployment training. "But we are professional problem solvers who happen to work with supplies and equipment. Understanding the full capabilities of your materials makes you more effective at solving any problem you might encounter." Her brigade's deployment was notably successful, with numerous instances of creative problem-solving that prevented supply shortages and equipment failures. Other military units began requesting similar training, recognizing the value of Sarah's innovative approaches. "She changed how we think about logistics," General Coleman said during a ceremony honoring Sarah's contributions to military doctrine. "Her willingness to think beyond conventional applications of supplies and equipment has made our entire force more adaptable and effective." As Sarah looked back on her career journey, from supply coordinator to senior officer, she reflected on how a single night in Afghanistan had shaped everything that followed. The decision to help wounded Rangers had led to innovations that improved military logistics worldwide. "I never set out to become famous or change military doctrine," she said during a speech at her alma mater. "I just wanted to help soldiers who needed assistance." Everything else grew from that basic commitment to service. The 11 shots she had fired that night weren't from a rifle, but from improvised explosive devices created through creativity, determination, and thorough understanding of available materials. Each explosion had eliminated enemy positions and contributed to saving the lives of wounded Rangers. But the real impact of her actions extended far beyond that single mission. Sarah Martinez had demonstrated that effective military service came from commitment to the mission rather than job classification, and that creative thinking could turn any soldier into a force multiplier when circumstances demanded it. Her legacy lived on in the thousands of logistics soldiers who had learned to think differently about their role, the innovative training programs that prepared military personnel for unconventional challenges, and the doctrine that emphasized adaptability and creative problem-solving throughout the military. 20 years after the night that changed her life, Sarah retired from active duty as a colonel, having shaped military logistics in ways that would benefit soldiers for generations to come. Her story remained a testament to the power of individual initiative, creative thinking, and unwavering commitment to helping others. The supply coordinator who had once worried about spreadsheets and inventory counts had become a military innovator whose ideas influenced operations around the world. But at its core, her story remained simple. When American soldiers needed help, she had found a way to provide it, regardless of conventional limitations or personal risk. In the end, that commitment to service proved more powerful than any weapon and more valuable than any traditional military capability. Sarah Martinez had shown that the heart of a warrior could beat just as strongly in a logistics specialist as in any combat soldier, and that courage came in many different forms. Her 11 perfect shots had been aimed not at enemy soldiers, but at the problems that prevented wounded Americans from receiving the help they deserved. Each shot had found its target, clearing the way for evacuation and medical treatment that saved lives. The precision hadn't come from marksmanship training, but from careful planning, thorough understanding of available materials, and absolute determination to succeed. In the most important sense, every shot had been perfect because each one had served the ultimate mission of bringing soldiers home alive. Years later, when military historians wrote about innovations in logistics and support operations, Sarah's story would serve as a defining example of how individual initiative and creative thinking could change the course of military operations. Her legacy would continue inspiring soldiers to look beyond conventional limitations and find new ways to serve their mission and protect their comrades. The night a supply coordinator became a warrior had proven that heroism wasn't defined by job classification or training specialty, but by willingness to act when action was needed. Sarah Martinez had embodied that principle completely, transforming not only her own life, but the way an entire military service understood the potential contributions of every soldier. Her story would continue to inspire new generations of service members to think creatively, act courageously, and never underestimate their ability to make a difference when their fellow soldiers needed help. In a world where conventional approaches weren't always sufficient, the Martinez method would continue providing the tools necessary to overcome any challenge through innovation, determination, and unwavering commitment to the mission.